I'm Cynthia Rowland, and this is episode 56 of EO Radio Show. Today we'll cover an important governance topic for all nonprofit organizations. That is, what leadership needs to know about internal investigations. I'm delighted to have my partner Aviva Gilbert with me today to answer a few frequently asked questions about internal investigations in the context of nonprofit organizations. Welcome to the EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource. Brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella, Braun & Martel. My name is Cynthia Rowland, and I'm a partner at Farella. I'm a business and tax lawyer with more than 30 years of experience advising clients on nonprofit and charity law. Through this podcast, our lawyers and guests will discuss a range of legal and business issues impacting the nonprofit world because we understand you work hard every day to make your community a better place to live and do business. Many of our programs focus on the basics, and at times we'll do a deep dive into narrow and complicated legal issues. Again, welcome to the EO Radio Show. We're glad you're here. Today, I'm happy to welcome my partner, Aviva Gilbert, to talk to us about internal investigations in the context of nonprofit organizations. Aviva represents individuals and companies in federal and state government enforcement, board-led investigations, and sticky situations that need investigation at the board level. Aviva has extensive experience appearing before and negotiating with agencies such as the U.S. Department of Justice, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the California Attorney General's Office. Aviva shepherds witnesses and defendants through all stages of government proceedings. Aviva represents public and private company board of directors, trustees, and committees, both in conducting the internal investigations and in managing challenging cultural and corporate governance issues. She has led multiple corporate culture reviews and often counsels board members, committees, and executives as an advisor. Her exposure to varied companies and a broad range of corporate dynamics help her serve as counsel, strategist, and sounding board for her director and executive clients. So of most importance today is her internal investigation experience. She has been involved in high-profile technology, healthcare, biotech, and consumer good companies, as well as financial services entities, educational institutions, and large public organizations. Welcome back, Aviva. I'm so glad to be able to talk to you about this topic today.
Thanks so much, Cynthia. What a great introduction. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, we're lucky to have you because I know you've got the perspective that will be very interesting to the nonprofit organizations that may not have faced an internal investigation, or maybe they already have. So let's talk a little bit about what exactly is an internal investigation. I know that's different perhaps than thinking about a criminal investigation where it's certainly external, not internal. So set the playing field. What are we talking about when we're thinking about internal investigations?
Sure. So when I think of internal investigations, I usually think of them as an investigation distinct from a government investigation. So there's no regulator. The attorney general isn't knocking on the door. There's no, FBI interest, but an issue has come up that is internal to the organization, whether it's nonprofit, for-profit, and it's sufficiently serious that the board or the governing body of the organization wants to take a look. And I'll give you a few examples because they really can range very much. A classic one is any kind of internal financial misconduct. Obviously, there could be a criminal investigation about that, but I mean an employee who is, let's say, falsifying expense reports, something like that. The government's not going to get excited about that, but it's important for an organization to look into it. Another one that we've seen quite a bit is what you mentioned in the introduction, which is cultural reviews. So that may be less specific to one allegation, but the board of directors or trustees or a governing body may be getting repeated complaints about cultural problems at the organization and may undertake an investigation to review what is it like to work here, essentially? What is it like to be in this organization? Because having answers to that question is an important part of good governance. Another big bucket of internal investigations are sort of specific allegations of misconduct by generally organizational leaders, whether that's a chief executive, a president, or somebody at a high level who isn't, the chief executive. But a good way to think about it is if it's a high risk situation that deserves board attention, but isn't likely to generate interest from a regulatory body or the government.
Two things that we're drawing a distinction about here is that board level investigations is what we're really focused on. Large organizations can investigate any manner of things, but what we're really focused on today is the board level. which has its own unique set of circumstances. And secondly, distinguishing between an investigation that's a good idea and kind of discretionary versus when you need to do it. Talk a little bit about that. What red flags would you see that would say this is not something that's really discretionary? The board needs to do an investigation, from the EDs or the board chair or the president. What triggers should key them to this needs to be done?
Yes, I think the specific allegations of misconduct by a current leader of the organization. That's how that's a need to do. Sort of non-specific complaints that I don't like working here, but hearing that quite a bit from different people, that's more of a want. The board may make the discretionary determination that looking at the organizational culture would be a good exercise of their governance obligations. But I would say that's not a need to do. That's a sort of good hygiene type of internal investigation. But if you're hearing that leaders or even multiple employees or even one employee, if the allegations are serious, are experiencing harassment, or a leader of the organization is accused of some specific type of dishonesty or abusive behavior, even if it's not something that the government would be interested in, I would say that the board or governing body should be taking a look. That's more of a need.
Who should conduct it? This often is a really dicey question in organizations with, I guess it's dicey sometimes when it's a very small board and also dicey when it's a really big board. I mean, how many people have to know about this?
It's always dicey.
Yeah.
I think the precursor to your question is, when would the board be leading the investigation as opposed to the HR department or somebody within the legal organization of the entity? The members of the board are the individuals who have fiduciary obligations to the organization, and to the extent anybody needs to do something, it's board members. There also may be political reasons why having employees of an organization conduct an investigation can be problematic, both because they may be significantly less objective, but they also are going to continue to work with each other, and interrupting that with something as disruptive as an investigation is problematic. So generally what happens is the board often is too large, as you mentioned, to all be involved in the investigation. And that wouldn't be desirable anyways. You don't need that many people involved. But typically a special committee of the board will be organized pursuant to the governing documents or charter of the organization to conduct this investigation. And that special committee should be empowered to hire its own counsel who specializes in doing exactly this. And their counsel will report to that special committee, but the investigation is undertaken in that committee's name.
All right, that makes sense. As we dive into some more details here, let's set the stage a little bit. Do you have any interesting reports of internal investigations in the nonprofit space? Obviously not our clients and not anything that we actually know anything about except what we read in the paper. You have some examples for us that'll give a little flavor to the conversation?
I do. Obviously, this is a space that I watch closely. So I'm going to talk, as you mentioned, about a couple of examples that I have not had anything to do with those cases, but I'm going to add some commentary that I have seen based on my practice because of trends in the space, put it that way. So one that I've been reading about that concluded this summer, had been going on for about a year, is a fairly small organization called the Orthodox Jewish Feminist Alliance. The name isn't important, but the board had received, it's a relatively small board, and the board had received complaints of inappropriate communications, inappropriate gifts that were sexual in nature, and general dissatisfaction by executives of the organization, specifically complaining about one individual. The threshold question was a legal obligation to investigate here. We have credible complaints of harassment. Was the board legally obligated to do something that it didn't do? And the investigating firm found that because the central complaints were coming from a former employee, the board did not have a legal obligation to investigate, but initially failing to investigate was a missed opportunity to really improve the organization. Those were the findings there regarding necessity. The board had received these complaints, had sort of failed to investigate deeply to understand both if they were true and also what should be done if they were true. And dissatisfaction with that response had been simmering for a while. And so the board decided to constitute a committee, hire counsel, and conduct an investigation into the allegations. Were they true? It turned out they were. The outside law firm that conducted the investigation determined that the individual had sexually harassed and created a culturally problematic workplace. Also that the board, again, had not failed in a legal sense, but had missed an opportunity to improve the organization and to respond appropriately. And one of the things that I found really interesting about that example is something that I've seen in my own practice in another investigation that I won't talk about, which is internal investigation that is looking at a prior investigation or lack of investigation, is investigating a response to misconduct or to allegations of misconduct. That's something that I've seen a couple of times in the last years where something happens, the board looks at it maybe briefly or doesn't look at it, or does, but there's questions about the sufficiency of that investigation. And then 2 years later, 3 years later, things haven't really improved. And so allegations resurface and the conversation starts again about the board's response 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and the Orthodox Jewish Feminist Alliance as an example of that. And I've also seen that with a couple of my clients where I end up coming on to look at how a previous board 2 years before responded to allegations.
Yeah, so that leads me to two thoughts. One is what I hear very often from my clients that are facing a situation like this is they just want it to be over with. They want to find out the problem and be done with it. Nobody serves on a nonprofit board in order to do internal investigations. Right. They have much better things to do, but charitable purpose for being involved. So getting it right the first time would be one observation I'd have on that. And then secondly, and this is jumping ahead a little bit, is how did this become public? A lot of times another driver of these investigations is we need to keep this as quiet and contained as possible. And yet sometimes they become, I'm guessing this was front page somewhere, maybe not on the New York Times, but how did this particular one get to your attention, and how do investigations sometimes become more notorious than what the board had hoped for?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think it's a particularly good question because it's an example of how things are different in the nonprofit universe and in the nonprofit space than in, say, a private company where, my internal investigation report is never going to make the news. I think culturally, there is, I don't know if it's an expectation, but an interest in transparency that is unique to the nonprofit space. And this came to my attention because the nonprofit organization that was conducting the investigation wanted to demonstrate to its constituents, its broader community, that they had taken this seriously and had responded appropriately and cleaning house is maybe too strong a word, but there's real interest in demonstrating how seriously the organization takes allegations of misconduct and how, there's nothing to hide. And I think we see that particularly in the nonprofit space, in quite a few examples where the final investigation report is made public. Sometimes they're put online, not always, because an organization really wants to have a clean slate, to be viewed as responsive to, and also in some cases to silence critics. If there are murmurings that the organization is not functioning optimally or the board is, derelict in its duty to take concerns seriously, if those communications or even rumors are happening, it can be really beneficial and in the best interest of the organization to demonstrate how seriously the board took allegations and how it responded.
But during the investigation itself, it's typically a privileged conversation,
Absolutely.
Right? The investigation itself and who says what to whom.
That's correct. I would say the decision to whether or not to make a report or findings public generally would be made at the conclusion of the investigation. You wouldn't start and say, okay, well, whatever happens here, we're necessarily going to publish it online. That's not the case.
That wouldn't be helpful.
That would not be helpful, I think, at all. But I do think that board members, after having conducted a thorough investigation, sometimes may decide that it's in the organization's interests to promote it. And of course, we're not going to know about the times when they decide not to do that. It's not a legal obligation to do so, but that's a judgment call. And a lot of these board members are very experienced, both in business universe and in the nonprofit universe, and they're going to apply their judgment to decide what they think is going to be in the best interest of the organization.
Any other notable newsworthy cases that you want to chat about today?
Yeah, there was one that I saw that I've been following that has been very interesting to me as somebody who sort of loves scholarship and thinks a lot about educational organizations. And this definitely made the news sort of all over California, the front page nationally, I think. And that was an investigation into the now former president of Stanford University, who was an academic and a researcher, and allegations arose regarding data underlying various publications that he had published over the years and necessitated very thorough investigation by a special committee of the Board of Trustees of Stanford University. That committee was staffed by panelists who were advanced degrees, who were scholars in their own fields and who had the scientific experience to be able to really evaluate the research that had been done, the findings, changes that were required, that kind of thing. So those were committee members with a real specialized skill. They also hired, of course, external investigators to assist in the investigation. The findings there were that Dr. Tessier Levine, that's who I'm talking about, the former president, that he didn't personally engage in any research misconduct. There were 12 papers about which they were looking at allegations. So the findings were that he didn't personally engage in any research misconduct, but some of those papers exhibit data manipulation of various types. And the conclusion was that these substandard practices happened within labs that he directed, but it wasn't his own misconduct. And so that was just a really interesting and very factually intensive investigation and conclusion. And so they found that he didn't exercise reasonable care in overseeing other researchers under him, but he himself had not been falsifying any data. So kind of a split verdict there in that sense.
Yeah, but still, I can only imagine the number of hours that went into that investigation.
The report is 90 pages long, so I suspect this was a extremely thorough, very time-intensive, unfortunately, probably quite costly investigation as well, but necessary.
So as we've talked about this Stanford situation, it makes me wonder if there are unique things about investigations of educational institutions. Not all educational institutions are nonprofits, but most of them are. And so there are any trends that you see in the educational institution arena and the way that they do things and think about investigations?
Good question. I think the biggest trend, I don't know if it's a trend, I think as institutions of all sizes, particularly large institutions, confront allegations of misconduct by executives or leaders. It doesn't have to be an executive. That misconduct deserves as much scrutiny in the educational space as it does in a more traditional corporate environment. And so I think we're seeing a lot of educational institutions take very seriously the types of concerns that we maybe historically would have thought of more as for-profit corporate boardroom allegations. I did an investigation a few years ago for an educational institution where there was concern that the communications to the board were not accurate. The president of the institution was transmitting inaccurate data to the board, and so affecting the board's ability to do its job. That's one type of allegation. Of course, we've seen various types of interpersonal or sexual harassment type allegations. Those are not unique to...
That's the same everywhere.
It's the same everywhere. The academic integrity is unique to research educational institutions. I don't think this is going to be the last investigation we see of a leader or a professor or an academic about the integrity of their data. There's one, I'm not super familiar with it, so I can't speak to the details today, but there was a series of allegations happening at Harvard Business School about a professor's academic honesty there. So I think there's going to be a sort of steady stream of those. But the takeaway really, there's different types of misconduct that is unique to a particular industry or type of organization. And then there's plenty of types of misconduct that is not unique to a particular industry. And so having your eyes and ears open to both as a leader or a board member of an organization is really important. What's unique to your business or your organization and what is not.
So this has been great. Before we wrap up, any final closing words of wisdom for our nonprofit leadership as they think about when and how to investigate?
Yeah, I think the best kind of single piece of advice that is what I just touched on, which is as a leader of an organization, you just have to keep your eyes open and your ears open to really take seriously even a whisper of misconduct. Just because something minor comes up doesn't mean a whole internal investigation is going to be spun up, but making sure that you're hearing that, communicating it up, because what if you get 15 sort of minor whispers of the same type of thing regarding a specific individual, that might necessitate a further look. So really keeping your eyes and ears open. And then for board members, making sure that you're talking to various leaders within the organization and not hearing only from one person all the time, I think is a really important thing for board members to be aware of. Sometimes it's a natural tendency to want all the information to be funneled through a president or chief executive. But in order to be a really good governor, it's valuable to have multiple contacts so you can make sure that you're getting accurate and varied perspectives.
Yeah, so that's great. That's super wisdom. And it does highlight the high degree of judgment that executives need to exercise, especially in nonprofits where trust and confidence of so many different constituents. You have the donor stakeholders, the employee stakeholders, the charitable beneficiaries. It's a big universe.
It's a big universe. Reputation matters, and we're just trying to help people be good governors.
So thank you so much, Aviva. This has been terrific. I'm sure it'll be useful to many of our listeners. We'll put links in the show notes to the governance topics on our playlist and a couple of other episodes where I've been fortunate to have Aviva's sage advice. And we'll put some other things in the show notes that listeners may find useful. Thanks for joining me, Aviva.
Oh, thanks so much, Cynthia. This was fun.
So that's all for this episode. Farella Braun and Martell now has a YouTube channel, and there are several nonprofit playlists, including one featuring governance topics like this one. So check out the show notes for the YouTube links and other links that may be useful. I'm Cynthia Rowland, and you've been listening to EO Radio Show, your nonprofit legal resource, brought to you by the Exempt Organizations Group at Farella Braun and Martell. If you have suggestions for topics you would like for us to discuss, please email us at eoradioshow@fbm.com. That's eoradioshow@fbm.com. Thank you for joining us. Until next time, make a difference.